This mystical Lewis was providentially sent, I believe, to live out his dialectic and to provide for the rest of us who are stranded that message in the bottle that Walker Percy, novelist and existentialist philosopher, has described. In short, the Father wrought his apostle, the Spirit dispatched him, the Son, the Word himself, lent to him expression.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 24, Mystical Perelandra, After Hours with Dr. James Como. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack, your favourite C.S. Lewis podcast run by three Thalcandrians. But today we continue our After Hours episodes, following on from reading Perelandra, and this opening quotation was from Mystical Perelandra, a book written by a repeat guest of the show, Dr. James Como. Professor James Como holds a PhD in Language, Literature and Rhetoric from Columbia University, and now is Professor Emeritus of Rhetoric and Public Communications at York College. He was a founding member of the New York C.S. Lewis Society in 1969. In addition to his many books, such as Why I Believe in Narnia and C.S. Lewis, A Very Short Introduction, he has written many journal articles on Lewis and provided many on-air commentaries for various Lewis biographical documentaries. He's one of the most highly regarded Lewis scholars in the world, and we're honored to welcome him here today. Dr. Como, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me back, David. It's always a pleasure. Always. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think the last time you were on the show, we were talking about Why I Believe in Narnia, one of your books, which is a collection of essays. What have you been up to since we last spoke?
Well, I'm writing a good deal. Retirement has been good to me. I'm publishing essays hither and yon. I just wrote on a book called Ironweed by William Kennedy. 40 years ago, it won the Pulitzer Prize. And since the author is now 97, I thought it was time to write an appreciation while he was still with us, to appreciate the appreciation. I'm preparing some lectures that I'll be giving in Florida and in Romania and in France coming up. I'm writing some short stories. So I'm fairly busy. My wife keeps me on my toes, as do my children and grandchildren now these days.
Wonderful. Well, today I am drinking an Athletic Brewing, a Kolsch. Are you drinking anything?
No, not right now. I'm not. I should be, though.
Normally you have a fancy cocktail.
Yes, I would be drinking an Aperol Spritz, but I didn't think to prepare one for me, so I'll have to make up for it when we're done.
That sounds like a plan. Cheers. So let's step back and talk about your personal history with Perelandra. You wrote a master's thesis on it, didn't you?
I did. And that was an effect, not a cause. I read Perelandra while I was deep into rhetorical studies and considering the concept of belief. Where does belief come from? What are its various causes? Because rhetoric is about persuasion. And I read Perelandra, and I just couldn't believe it. It struck me on so many levels of belief, intellectual, imaginative, spiritual levels. It just knocked me over. And I decided to answer a question: how? How did it achieve this effect? Of course, I knew I wasn't alone. I already knew that Lewis had gotten letters from readers asking about Elwyn Ransom on Perelandra, so an awful lot of people believed it literally, which I didn't. But nevertheless, I dug into it, and the result was the master's thesis. At that point, now this is almost 60 years ago that this is happening. Lewis, as a mystic, had not yet sunk its roots into me. That would come later when I read more and more of Lewis. I went back to Perelandra many times, and as I did so, the belief deepened that Lewis, though reluctant to say so, reticent about his gift, was in fact a mystic. David Downing's book, Into the Region of Awe, was instrumental here. I'll tell you something interesting that occurred to me too. We all know the story of Lewis beholding the toy garden made by his brother Warren.
Mhm.
and how that overwhelmed him. His first experience of Zane's overwhelmed him. Now, there's nothing terribly unusual about seeing something that takes hold of you. It's happened to me many times, I'm sure you and many people. But for it to be such a sign of the living God and to endure for a lifetime strikes me, frankly, as preposterous. A toy garden beheld by what, a 6-year-old at the time, a 7-year-old maybe, is going to have his entire belief system upended and his life changed. Preposterous, unless those mystical receptors were already in place. And I think that's the case with C.S. Lewis. You don't become a mystic when you turn 13 or go through adolescence or puberty. You have those receptors, or you don't. Now, some people believe we all do. I'm not sure that's not the case. My receptors, if I have any, are low functioning, although I've had my experiences. But Lewis's weren't. Lewis's were high functioning. And that was the first sign of it. And that is what makes that episode not preposterous. It's the first of many signs of Lewis's mysticism. And so my experience with the book matured late in my life, just a few years ago, almost 60 years after the fact. I decided to write a book about Perelandra and what the book meant to me, along with what Lewis has meant to me and what other readers of Lewis have meant to me. And I'll tell you one of the provocations I think you might be interested in knowing. There seems to be a subgenre of writers. Now, Lewis has always had his opponents. And some people have written very candid rebuttals of Lewis and attacks upon Lewis. Philip Pullman, the febrile Philip Pullman, comes to mind. But that's not the genre I'm talking about. I'm talking about a more subtle genre. I'll call it the Lewis recovery genre. Those writers who were, in their words, taken in by Lewis, enchanted by Lewis, but then, and you have to be reminded of Susan in the Chronicles, got over it.
Yeah.
And now wanted to explain to the world what had happened to them and why it no longer matters. So I wanted to write a book that was the opposite. Perelandra struck me and sunk roots into me a long, long time ago, 60 years ago. And not only have I not gotten over it, it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. Just the opposite of those subgenre writers. So I thought this might be a nice antidote to what they do. Now, as for the genre of the book, I think you might be curious to know that. I can't tell you the genre of the book. I do know there's such a thing as life writing. People who talk about a book or a genre or reading, maybe it's music, maybe it's painting, in terms of their biographical experience. And so that's what I did, because I couldn't understand this book without describing its entanglement with my life. It's like a double helix. It's the book, a triple helix. Lewis, the book, and me.
Yeah, in one of the chapters, you say this book isn't an argument, a treatise, or a monograph. And as I was reading it, yes, although you talk about the meaning of the book, I would say it's much more reflective rather than analytical. You're not so much unpacking all of the details of the book, but speaking about how the reflected light from the sun, so to speak, has bounced back on you.
It occurred to me at one point when I was reading Perelandra, suddenly like a light bulb going on. Not quite a great epiphany, but just a realization. My goodness, as odd as this sounds, this is about me. This really is about me. Well, wait a minute. It's also about Lewis. Oh, well, wait a minute. It's also about very, very many people who have gone through this 3-stage process of purgation, illumination, and unitiveness. I have a long way to go with purgation myself, but this book showed me it was a map, a spiritual map, spiritual theology, more than 1,000 years of Christian theology, spiritual theology, the development of the soul at work as a map. And Lewis found the perfect parallels to it. You know, when Ransom falls into the sea and sinks down as low as you can get, and then works his way up in a cave, but not any cave, of course, a dark cave with no light. What do you expect, right? And of course, we know the end. He finds himself at the pinnacle of the mountain, and the rest, as they say, is history. So yes, it's about me. It was about Lewis, who wrote more than one autobiography, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Andrew Lazo, it's one of his repeated chimes about how he did it in basically every genre available.
Yes. And by the way, Andrew Laszlo is not a man I will argue with.
I do regularly. It's okay.
I don't know if I told you the story once. I was seated next to Andrew. I was speaking at the C.S. Lewis Foundation, and Andrew was next to me. And we started to talk about another great favorite of ours, Till We Have Faces.
Mm-hmm.
I said, how well do you know it? And he said modestly, well, I know it fairly well. I said, all right, let me quiz you, Andrew. What is the first turning point of the book? When Orwell first realizes truth, but turns her back on it. And he said, oh, that's an easy one, James. That's page 96 in the original edition, when she's at the top of the mountain and feels joy for the first time. And I thought, I'm probably out of my league here with Andrew, but I'm delighted to know that he too believes that Lewis wrote biographically many, many times. Well, why else? Lewis, and I know that this term stirs unease in many people. He wrote existentially. Now, that doesn't mean Lewis was an existentialist, which I'm told he didn't like. In fact, I'm told he really had no patience with the godfather of existentialism, who was Soren Kierkegaard. But he writes out of an experience which compels choice. And that's the nub of existentialism. I'm on a bus. There's a door. Shall I go through it or not? I shall. I'm a theist. I'm in a sidecar. Is Jesus the Son of God or not? Yes, okay, he is. And now I'm a Christian. You know, that sort of thing. This is why in Surprised by Joy, Lewis does a terrible job, a really terrible job of describing his conversion. Mm-hmm. And he said this, I was going over his letters the other day. I came upon another one of my favorites. He tells one of his correspondents, I really can't tell you. Don't look to me for guidance about a conversion because I'm helpless. He had certain dots. Conscience, you know, that kind of thing, joy. He connected the dots, and that was it. So here he's writing existentially because Ransom has to make a choice. You know, not for nothing are you two called Ransom. You know, but I need help. No, you don't get it, Ransom. You're the help that they need. You know? And it's just magnificent.
Well, you've mentioned mysticism a few times already, and the mystical ascent, the purgative, illuminative, and unitive way. Would you mind just unpacking that a little bit? So, first of all, what does it mean for Lewis to be a mystic?
Well, I guess it means the same thing that it means for the great mystics that we know of from the Middle Ages. David Downing has a quote in his book from someone else where he points out to us that St. Paul was the first great Christian mystic. Because there's vision. He has a vision. Now, Lewis was a rhetoric machine. So any expression that comes forth from Lewis is going to be well formulated, structured beautifully, expressed imagistically with great appeal, and therefore seem to be artificial. But that's only because he has to communicate with us.
The mere mortals.
Yes, we can't do the Vulcan mind meld when Lewis is having a vision, and sees what's going on there. But there was a lot going on there, and he did have visions. We could take this back to Coleridge and so on. It can become tiresome. Coleridge by way of MacDonald, by way of Owen Barfield, and so on. But the end of Perelandra is so rapturous that one forgets he is reading a book. You almost think you're reading scripture, but then you forget that too. And there you are, beholding the great dance, where everything, even the particle of dust, is the center, which is straight out of Saint Bonaventure, by the way, the ubiquitous center. We go from the delicious landscape of Perelandra, the taste of the fruit, the color of the sky, the warmth of the ocean on his body, the wonderful meeting with animals on the Perelandran landscape, to the depths of whatever it is, purgation, and then rise again to this sidereal, no, I take that back, celestial vision. We've really made the whole trip with Lewis through this. And I note, by the way, that this book comes almost exactly at the center point of his writing career. So he was in full flame when he writes Perelandra, or when the book comes out, at least. So much happened in the 40s. I mean, I think he must have found a way to clone himself, because he did so much. You look at Lewis's production, and then you add his job, which was to lecture and tutor, and then you add his walking tours, and then you add his bouts with the Inklings, and then you add his bouts with the Socratic Club. Did the man sleep? It's hard to know, but this was dynamic, providential energy that we see in full furnace.
Well, before we dig into a couple of topics that you bring up in your book, would you mind just giving us an overview of how you move through it? Because I think particularly with this sort of book, particularly with the triple helix of Lewis's life, your life, and Perelandra, I found it was really helpful to read the book and then sit back and then trace the trajectory that through which we passed. So for people that have either read it or people who are going to read it, would you mind just laying out the land ahead of us?
David, are you saying you studied my book?
I don't have Lewis's capacity, but I can just about hold down a job, a family, and an occasional book.
Okay. Well, the book has 6 chapters, and each 2 chapters are a section. Chapters 1 and 2 are one bit, 3 and 4 are something else, and then 5 and 6 are a third section. And I envision it as an ascent. So the first 2 chapters talk about Lewis's past, his relationship with language, his apologetic life, the limits of his apologetic work. That gets us to the limits of language, as you referred to earlier. And then we get to the book itself. How did Lewis tell this story? And I introduced some scholars who were very important to me, and one of whom was very important to Lewis, Wayne Booth and I.A. Richards. I'm not sure that Lewis did not know Wayne Booth's book, but we do know he knew I.A. Richards.
Mm-hmm.
I have a copy of The Principles of Literary Criticism by I.A. Richards that Lewis owned, given to me by Walter Hooper.
Mm-hmm.
And it's filled with Lewis's annotations. It's just a trove of Lewis's insights. And Walter told me a story once about I.A. Richards visiting him, and Walter showing Richards Lewis's copy of Richards' own book. And Richard sat for an hour reading Lewis's annotations and said, I wish I had read these before I wrote the book. It would have been such a much better book if I had. So that, with Lewis, there's a triumvirate. There's Booth on thinking about narrator. There's Richards on levels of meaning, which are very important, and then an experiment in criticism, which is a woefully neglected masterpiece. And do you know why? Because it is so short. It is so unadorned by meaningless jargon. It so fails to partake of highfalutin theory or any movement that it can't be taken seriously, can it? I mean, by literary professionals.
I actually have a different theory as to why it's not so popular. I think because it bursts way too many bubbles. Too many literary people will find out that they are not, in fact, literary people.
Yes, and you know who was one of them? F.R. Leavis was one of them. But it tells us much that we need, so especially about myth, especially about storytelling. So that was chapters 3 and 4. And then chapter 3, chapter 4 gets into myth and the power of myth, the origins of myth. I speak about two writers whom Lewis knew very well, Sir James George Frazer, The Golden Bough, and Carl Jung. He had read a lot of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. And when you put these two together, Frazer and Jung, you have an inventory of archetypes that are right there in Perelandra, right there in Perelandra. And so that's when belief really takes hold, when the reader is overcome not by narrative skill or descriptive expertise, all of which is there, but by forgetting he's reading a book and is partaking of some myth, which of course is mentioned in the book itself. Then we get to the chapter on strife, chapter 5, and in spiritual theology, strife is very, very important. And that's where action comes into play. What are you going to do about it? There was a really good film called The Untouchables from some decades ago with the great Sean Connery won an Academy Award.
Yes. And also Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves himself, Kevin Costner.
Yes. You remember the scene when he finds Costner bleeding to death on the floor of his own apartment?
Oh, that was heavy, yeah.
Connery has something grasped in his hands, a railroad timetable. He's bleeding. He's gone. And he grabs Costner and he pulls him to him. So he gets his own blood on Costner. I think it was this line that won Connery the Academy Award. He looks into his eyes and Sean Connery, what are you willing to do? What are you willing to do? Well, Ransom, what are you willing to do? Well, Como, what are you willing to do? And it's a very, very compelling question. The strife in Perelandra is a strife I've never experienced, of a kind I've never experienced. I've experienced very great strife, and I mentioned the sources of that strife in the book. And I do so because I don't think it's irrelevant. And I do think that anybody reading the book could dwell upon the strife in their lives as well, and think of the price they're paying. But then, of course, after the strife comes hope and awe and holiness. And Ransom himself is overwhelmed. So we go from, at the beginning, a discussion of Lewis and language, his abandonment of language, to a vision that Ransom has literally, which is transmitted through Lewis's visionary mystical capacity. By way of a mysterious narrator, a narrator called Lewis, we have to remember that this is a story being retold by a man a year after it happened. Not a year after he heard it, but a year after the events being described. And there's Lewis, who's kind of a surrogate for the rest of us normal people. In this book, he's a normal Lewis. And there you have it. So that's the progression of the book. You mentioned Puddleglum before. What made you mention Puddleglum?
Well, it was actually the next section that I wanted to talk about, which was I think probably the biggest thing that really jumped out to me in the book. That it's one of those things that when it's pointed out, you think, how on earth did I ever miss this? In the book, you spend some time talking about the tension between words and actions. And that's very clear in Perelandra because you have lots of argument, and then a left hook. And that's when things actually start really getting going. And you pointed out in your book about Puddleglum, that when they're in the underworld and the Lady of the Green Kirtle is drawing Puddleglum and the children into her enchantment, getting them to forget that there are upper worlds, dragging them back down into Plato's cave. It's not argument that really gets them out of this. It's a marshwiggle putting his foot on a fire and enduring the suffering, but it's his action that actually saves the day. Not rhetoric, not fancy words. And when you mentioned that, I suddenly thought, oh, this is everywhere in Lewis. It's until we have faces. I've just mentioned it's in the Silver Chair. It's in the Great Divorce. What about the man? The only person we actually see saved in the entire narrative is somebody with a lizard on his shoulder, and he's giving excuse after excuse after excuse. But it's only when he makes the decision, the choice to say, "Just do it," and the angel then crushes the lizard, that we actually see his redemption. And so that was what I kind of really wanted to talk about next. This surprising tension in Lewis, and ironic also because he had a real gift of rhetoric, but this tension between words and actions.
You notice that all of the choices you described are choices to endure pain. Puddleglum stepping on a fire has to hurt. Nothing brings you to your senses faster than the smell of burning marshwiggle. And, of course, Ransom, when he makes his choice, he knows he's going to have to physically fight this man with these long fingernails, and he's not a fighter. He's a philologist. About fight. Not only does he not have a choice, and here's the existential part, he knows he doesn't have a choice. It's up to him. He has to do it. So there is this tension when finally, words, and perhaps this means even prayer, have to stop. And you just put yourself, as St. Ignatius did, in the presence of God. And instead of speaking, you listen. And if you act, it might be an action that chooses pain. Now, something needs to be said about Lewis and words. I have long argued, and I wrote another book about Lewis's rhetorical genius. He was one of the great masters, and I recently, an article is coming out next month where I argue that Lewis should be included in the canon. He should be included in the English syllabus of 20th century writers.
No argument here.
If I taught 50 years. I professed at the college level, and including composition, many texts, and only once did I find Lewis used as an example of expertise for a certain type of writing. Only once. Now, was anyone better at arguing, at describing, at exposition, at narration? Many as good, perhaps, but none better, and yet he's not there. So I argue that Lewis should be in that syllabus. You went a course called English Literature in the 20th Century, you'd better include C.S. Lewis. However, and this is a point I make in the book, and I've made it elsewhere, he wasn't enthralled by his own gift. He enjoyed it. But he feared it as well. He has this wonderful poem called The Apologist's Evening Prayer, which was not published during his lifetime, when he bemoans the effect that his rhetoric has. While the audience laughs, angels weep. And the last few lines are just heartbreaking. He uses the word trumpery to refer to all of his literary and apologetic achievements, and he begs God, Lord of the narrow gate and needle's eye, take from me all my trumpery, lest I die. there's a letter where he says, rhetoric just has this magic on me. I was listening to Hitler's speech the other night, and, I'd be a terrible policeman. While I'm listening to the speech, I'm actually believing it as I hear it. By the way, that was the day after that, he conceived of the screw tape letters. So, very interesting. So he was troubled by this gift, and in the late 40s and early 50s, he had his own dark night of the soul, and was afraid. He tells this to the Italian priest, now Saint Giovanni Calabria, that he thinks he has nothing left to. His pen is dry. He has nothing left to write, but that's okay, because I've been being tempted to pride by all of the great response to my work, and it's starting to get to me. So if the price of resisting that sin is never writing another word, thank God, so be it.
Blessed be he.
Yeah. So it was a two-edged sword for Lewis, and he knew how to put it down. After that dark night, his rhetoric changed a bit. It became even more oblique until we finally have letters to Malcolm, which, are not letters to a man named Malcolm, as we know. But just a kind of, I'm wondering about this, Malcolm. I'm just wondering, I'm not going to use argument or ratiocination or wonderful analogies, because I can, I have a gift for analogies.
Mm-hmm.
But he couldn't even in Malcolm, he couldn't resist another great gift he had. Lewis had a very great gift, and I'll use a term from rhetoric, had a very great gift of peroration, the final section. Now, if you read the final section of Miracles, this tightly wrought argument, you get this glorious peroration. If you read The Problem of Pain, which is not as tightly wrought, but still logically argued, at the end you get a chapter called Heaven and a wonderful peroration. Even in his essays, he couldn't. Even in Mere Christianity, the end of Mere Christianity, it's not a happy ending. It's not a happy peroration, but my goodness, is it powerful? So even in Letters to Malcolm, which is so casual and offhand, that one great gift of rhetoric that he had, he could not put down, and that was a good ending.
Yeah. The other example I thought of was The Weight of Glory. I mean, yes, it's great, but the ending is just like, dang.
It's just, he would end whole paragraphs like that. There would be a paragraph of logically wrought argument ending with a glorious image. Even in his scholarship, he did that. He has a section in the Allegory of Love when he's talking about Chaucer, and he talks about Chaucer as the poet of happiness, and he makes his point beautifully. The paragraph goes on for another 27 lines, and then he ends with an image. I hope I don't ruin this. The vineyard has borne, the Provençal village has borne its fruit, and that fruit has been given to us by this greatest poet. Wonderful and perfect image.
When you read those sections, you feel lifted up. You feel like you're St. Paul being drawn up into the heavens. And so how do words become both a stumbling block to mysticism, but then also a bridge to it?
Well, it may depend upon the reader. Some people put on all kinds of armor against that happening to them. As Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, they'll see through it, like in that subgenre I described. And of course, he goes on to say, if you see through everything, then everything is invisible. So those readers, we can forget about. I mean, if you're going to gird yourself against any enchantment, that's your choice. And you'll be one of those dwarves at the end of the last battle who never makes it. Okay. Hell is locked from the inside. But if you're not one of those, the words work from your intellect into your imagination until the images start to pile up. But it's not random images. It's not like berries thrown into a cake. they accumulate one upon another. So at first they're merely pleasurable. Then they become possible. Then they become plausible. And then they become the objects of great desire. And that's where Sehnsucht enters into the picture. And they blossom forth, as you just intimated, into hope. And I think Lewis's great apologetic achievement is hope. He's the great apostle of hope. My Christian faith as a Catholic was never in doubt to me. Not from the earliest I can remember until this moment. But hope was shaky, really shaky. And it was reading Lewis that reinstilled that hope in me. I know there's a heaven. I know it's glorious. I know I can get there. Follow the signs, and I can make it. And he has scripture to back it up. I quote some scripture in the book as well. So that's how I think it works. Words are basically intellectual devices. But once the intellect starts to synthesize the words into an image, the imagination clicks in. And if the imagination burns white hot, the spirit is there. And that's how I think it happens. Now, that makes things sound much too systematic, so I better just...
I'm an engineer. I like systems.
Okay.
And to tie it into Lewis's book on Screwtape, there you have the intellect, the imagination, and then the next level is the will. And so that takes us back to where we began when talking about that moment of decision.
Yes, a decision for strength. Not unlike, exactly like our Lord. He made a decision.
Set his face like flint.
I will submit to this. Not only to this humiliation, but to this agony, physical agony. That's my strife. And I'll do it because you all must do a simulacrum of it. I'm doing it for you as the real thing. So, yes, we're all enacting Jesus, and you'll remember that there's a certain point, and this too is out of Bonaventure, when Ransom beholds the face of Tor, he sees the face of Jesus. Yeah. He sees the face of Jesus. So, how many of us could be Ransom? How many of us would want to be in Ransom's shoes? I don't know. But in one way, we're all in Ransom's shoes, I think. All of us.
Well, we've spoken quite a little bit about the final chapters of Perelandra, and as we were reading through it this season, I would say at least the last 3 or 4 chapters, I had to really crack the whip to make sure that we got through the chapter in an hour. I just didn't feel like there was enough time to cover everything in detail. Right from the point that Ransom kills the young man, he ascends through the darkness, he's recuperated, he's even tended to by the planet itself, and then he ascends the mountain, and then of course you have the great dance at the end. So I just wanted, in the little bit of time we've got left, I just want to give you some space to say anything you like about this book's climax, because quite frankly, I don't think we've said enough about it on this season thus far.
Well, the problem with the end of Perelandra is the same problem we have with words. You stop talking about it and read the book. You really can't say much about it without quoting it at great length.
Yeah.
And then you whomever you're quoting it to, either you get it or you don't. But one of the things I would suggest a person does with it, take your time with it, but read it aloud. Lewis said, right for the ear, read it aloud, and you will be enthralled. You'll be awed by Lewis's command of rhythm. And all of his sentences, Lewis had a keen ear, a keen sense of rhythm. You'd have a long sentence punctuated by a short sentence, to call. He knew how to keep things moving and varied and so on. But in the great dance, my goodness, and you'd think that it becomes just repetition, or blessed be he, blessed. But before each benediction is a new revelation. So if you read it slowly, out loud, and see it as you read it, you're no longer reading a book. You're standing next to Ransom and you're seeing this. And so, whether there are 9 levels of planets, each in a crystal orbit, presumed over by nature, or not, it doesn't matter. You've seen how the heavens work. Everything is the center. And you can read it again and again. You can read it as part of your Lenten reading. You can read it anytime. And you don't have to read the whole thing all through. You can read snatches of it and be rewarded.
Just that final chapter, I think I was listening to it on audiobook. I think I probably listened to it about 25 times before we recorded the episode, just trying to get all of that into my head. And I also went and read the poetic versions that Ruth Pitter wrote, and we've interviewed Dr. Don King this season as well about those. But yeah, I think if anybody's, say, going to adoration or spending time in a chapel, for devotional reading, I don't think you could go too far wrong with a final chapter of Perelandra.
No, you can't go too far wrong at all. By the way, you listening to an audiobook. I've never heard it. Who does the reading? Is it anyone I would know?
Let me check.
When Oxford brought out my very short introduction to Lewis, they gave me the good news that it would be an audiobook.
Yeah.
So I told my wife, I said, "Love, we speak in Spanish often. I'm getting an audiobook." And she says, "Who's doing the reading?" I said, "I haven't chosen yet." "Well, if it's not Richard Burton, I'm not interested." And I said, "But you understand, Richard Burton has been dead for quite a while." She said, "That doesn't matter. This is the Oxford University Press. They'll work something out." So, I had my competition with Richard Burton.
Was pretty sure it was. I wanted to check first. Yes. So this was Geoffrey Howard. He does the main version, but I actually just got a new one that was just released by the BBC. So it's the first 2 books in the series with the full reading, and then That Hideous Strength is presented as basically a radio play.
Oh, interesting. Well, you've done quite a job in dealing with Perelandra for so many episodes. 24? Am I number 24?
Yeah, I think yes, you are. So we did one episode per chapter, and then I think we had 4 or 5 episodes following afterwards. So with Dr. Junius Johnson, just digging into that final chapter and all the richness that was there, the poetic versions and the poetry in that final chapter. I think we've done a retro. I think that's it. Maybe one more. But yeah, this was a book I'd actually only read it once before this season, and I took it down in one big gulp. And so when I was thinking back to it, I realized that this is one that we are definitely going to have to go through it slowly. We can't combine chapters.
I think it's the pinnacle of Lewis's mystical writing. I also think it's kind of a summa of Western thought, especially medieval thought. And there's one more thing I'd like to say before our time is up. I think I quote this in the book. At one point, Lewis, maybe he was coming out of a coma, maybe he was waking up from a deep sleep, but Walter Hooper was there with him. And he sprang up to a seated position in bed, and he said, oh my, I never imagined. So clearly he had seen something. And what I would like to tell Lewis is, Jack, you did imagine. And we're all grateful for you for that vision that you've had. And by the way, don't be shy about being a mystic. It's okay.
Yeah, he wrote about Lazarus really being the first martyr because he got to die and then was made to come back. And reading about that incident, it seems like that Lewis had a very similar sort of feeling. And you see something also in Ransom. At the beginning of Perelandra, he's pining for Malacandra. I want to go back there. But by the time you close the book of Perelandra, this is where he really wants to be. And to go back to Earth, it's like he's dying. He's getting back into the coffin.
Yes, well, that's another price he has to pay. That's another ransom, so to speak, that he has to pay.
To quote a Tolkien character, it was saved, but not for me.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you have great fun with your podcast, David.
I do. It keeps me out of trouble. Keeps me off the streets.
Okay. Did I see a little tyke run by in the background at a certain point?
Yes, Alexander came up and he was very interested to know what was going on. I will go and see what he wants in a moment. But before I go and see what my son wants, where can people go to find out more about you, read your essays and your books?
Well, they can go to Amazon.com. I have an author's page there. I just brought up a book on Amazon of essays and short stories, both of which are suitable for general readers. I have a website, jamescomo.com, and if they go to the curriculum vitae page, they can see the whole life story. Some of what I've written has been a memoir about my professional life and so on. I don't know if it's interesting to anybody else, but Amazon.com should do it. I've written some fantasy children's tale set in mid-19th century Italy called Brusco and Giovanni. Brusco is a giant talking wolf, and Giovanni is his young friend, a boy who's a friend. That started from a story told to me by my Italian grandfather, and then I just embellished. There's a giant snake, Jubileo, and so on. So there's a wide variety of essays, literary journalism, cultural journalism, argument, some politics, literary criticism. That's what I like to do best. As I mentioned, William Kennedy is the one I wrote recently on Ironweed, which was a sensation back in the early 80s. Robertson Davies, Sigrid Undset, Thornton Wilder, a great favorite of mine, a very great favorite of mine. So they'll find anything there on my website and on Amazon.
Wonderful. Well, I hear the call for final drinks, so thanks again to Dr. Como for joining us today. Thanks to our intern Julia, our sound engineers Taylor and Sarah, and thanks to our patron supporters, particularly our top tier supporters. Dan, Jody, Robert, Mark, Mary Margaret, Rowdy, Angela, David, Peter, Kate, James, John, Sarah, Rebecca, Megan, Brian, Joanna, Kelly, Stephen, Gary, Paul, Kay, Becca, Shane, Thomas, Amanda, Joel, Erica, Matt, James, Bud1, Bud2, Edgar, Aldo, Kevin, Mark, and of course, all of you for listening. And please join us again next time when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.